what was your focus or foci, as it were, undergrad, master's, and PhD? What would you focus on?
Yeah, so I got essentially a religion undergrad degree from Baylor. It's a little more complicated than that, but the details don't really matter. But I was mostly in the religion department there. I came to seminary here and did a biblical languages MA, and then went on to PhD in New Testament with a minor in Old Testament. So really, yeah, I mean, it's very similar to what my dad did, and now I'm come on here as he's retiring. So I always tell the joke, they just wanted to save money on changing the names on stuff.
Name.
That is just crazy. Easier for them that way. So,
because if I remember, you're the fourth, right? You're Dr. Charles Ray, the fourth?
The third, yeah.
Third, okay.
I'm actually a third generation PhD graduate from NOBTS. So, yeah.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. So his dad.
Yep.
I did not know that. That is crazy.
My grandfather graduated, must have been in the 50s, if I'm guessing. And I graduated in the 70s.
That has to be unique.
Yeah. So they did a little article on it. Matter of fact, I've got it hanging on my office wall over here. You can tell that was the first ever third generation PhD graduate, maybe even from a SBC seminary. I'm not 100%.
Wow. That is so cool.
So yeah, it was cool. They let my grandfather come up. My dad was actually over the PhD program at the time. So he was a part of my hooding. And then they let my grandfather come up and do the other part of it.
Oh, that is
pretty, yeah, it was pretty cool.
That is so cool. That is so cool, man. That really is.
So we go back a long way here.
Yeah, no, you do. And before I want my listeners to hear more of your specialty, and we talked to that before I do that. I just want to, sparing some details, I want to praise you publicly, because I remember, for most of my audience and my podcast listeners don't know my background in that area of my life in childhood, which is fine, just because in my podcast, I try not to talk about me much unless it's about, I don't know, unless it's apropos, I guess. I've never been a kind of person who likes to listen to someone's, when I was a kid, or I went fishing. I don't know. I just,
yeah, right.
But when I was, so I don't know how old I was now. So I'm guessing I was around 14 years old. My dad decided to continue his theological education at New Orleans Seminary, and we were living in Mississippi at the time. And it was a somewhat of a tumultuous time, because right around the same time period, my brother's best friend, one of his very best friends, a guy who was my age, and I was friends with him, but close to my brother's name was Brent. Brent died tragically on a gun accident, and that happened around the exact same time. And then we went to New Orleans, and I moved there. I finished out my freshman year in high school, then moved down to New Orleans. So I was there in the summer of the sophomore year, and of course did the fall of the sophomore year. And so, of course, I didn't know anybody, and all my friends were gone. And I'd spent all my entire life in a small town in Mississippi, South Jackson, Mississippi, and basically the same spot. And that was a very, very difficult time. And the girls and the guy, I mean, all this stuff, you long. And I remember sitting in my little bitty apartment there in New Orleans, listening to Bon Jovi and what was that song? Never say goodbye. Never. Oh, I'd sing it over and over. Oh, yes, the angels sang with me, because I could never say goodbye. And I'd write letters way before emails, way of the Stone Age. And we'd write letters, some of my friends, like, what are y'all doing? I miss y'all. And that was a tough time. Anyway, and then I ended up going to walk around New Orleans Seminary, which was, podcast listeners, basically a big U shape, like a horseshoe, basically. Mm-hmm. And the horseshoe ends at a street. Anyway, so you just kind of walk around everywhere, and you see other kids about my age wandering around doing nothing. And every once in a while, I found a gym. You go in the gym, and you see kids like, oh, there's other kids about my age. And realize we're all stuck in the same situation, because, I mean, someone in our family has been going to the school, and so we're walking around. And then to find out people go to school and whatnot. And then I met this kid named Charlie, and his dad was a professor there, Dr. Charles Ray, the second, and New Testament professor, but we ended up carpooling, and we would carpool with Charlie, and Charlie had a little younger brother, an older sister, and then I'm missing someone.
Yeah, another younger sister. Yeah.
A younger sister, that's right. And anyway, Charlie became certainly my closest guy friend, and the guy who was you were a year beneath me in grade, I think it was.
I don't want to say it's 2. I graduated from McMain in 98.
Okay, there was two. Yeah, so that was two. But anyway, played the trumpet. Certainly, as a Christian, I was a Christian. I think we went to the same church, didn't we? Go to the same church?
You went to Edgewater?
Yeah, Edgewater.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, all that stuff. So all that to say, what I'm praising is and then my parents are getting divorced. So I was there in New Orleans about 10 months, roughly 9-10 months. And then when my dad left, and then since there was no one in our family enrolled in school, we had 3 days to get off campus. And so then during that Christmas break time, and it was a very, very difficult time. And then, so it's just tumultuous. I mean, I had some good memories of New Orleans, such a very different world from a small town in Mississippi. And now that certainly, having lived in Mississippi, New Orleans is it feels like a different world sometimes.
Sure.
The religious background, the whole culture is very different. So in that time period, though, however, your family was just a very big support for me, and there were a handful of families that were like the youth pastor there at Edgewater.
Mm-hmm.
There were two of them there, two different youth pastors I remember, and we're just absolutely the hands and feet of God, and in a very, very tough time. So I just thank God for you, Charlie, and your friendship for all those times. I mean it. And I told Kevin that too, your brother, and I've told God that many times. But it's funny. I'm 42 now, and yet I remember a lot of those events like it was yesterday. I mean, it's amazing how much those kind of little footnote, those kind of stories that I play in my mind, they always have helped me through the years remember how much we just don't know the impact we're having. And it might seem so insignificant at the time. And even as a child to think, yeah, but there's certain moments they're just formative events. And I could go for a long list of formative events. Anyway, so it's just so cool to see you again, catch up again. And it was so cool to hear, of course, your trajectory in theological education, especially since I did the similar thing and similar interest. And it was just so cool. So it's great.
Yeah. No, it's good to catch up. I didn't realize you were there for such a short time. It seems like, I have a lot of memories from there. We were, and people won't have as much interest in this, but I was joking with you on Facebook Messenger. You were older than me, so I kind of looked up to you, and you were the actually good trumpet player, and I was so and you even had me wearing a tie. That was
had you wearing a tie? Yeah, for a while I was really excited about wearing ties to school. That was kind of in fashion. That was still correct.
So yeah,
had me wearing a tie to school. And tell people what you said today about going down to French Quarter or something.
Yeah, so you said you didn't remember this, but you would always try to talk me into getting our trumpets out, and we put our trumpet cases out and go play in the French Quarter and see if we could make some money. That's what you always wanted to do, and I don't think you talked me into the tie, but you didn't talk me into going in the French Quarter. So
I don't remember that, but I can see doing that very much so, which is funny about we can make some money. I could hear it, but it's funny because my son does the same thing. He's like, Dad, except he just wants free money. But he thinks of ways he could get them. And I say, baby, go out there, go do something, go wash some cars. And
that's funny.
Well, the French Quarter, I remember, it's funny the things you remember, but I remember being in class at the school where Charlie and I went, was a magnet school. And people from all over different walks of life, came there. And I remember sitting in class. I don't remember what the class was, but I remember exactly where I was sitting. And to my left was this a young, I want to say woman. She's a girl, white girl, and but she was a different look. I mean, again, where I'm from, she looked a little more goth, real white, black hair and stuff. It was nice, and I thought she was kind of pretty. And I remember chatting with her son, but being nervous, and some other people in the class from all kinds of walks of life. And I remember one time we would talk about religion sometime, every once in a while, being a Christian. And one time she said, "Oh, I thought of you, David, the other day." And I said, "Oh, did you?" Of course, as a ninth grader, like, "Oh yeah, did you?" Or 10th. I think I was a 10th grader. So, and I said, And she goes, "Yeah, because her and her mom or something, I think they went shopping and found these crystals. They found it was some religious thing. They thought it was significant to them, and it was something." And I remember I go, "Oh, I didn't know how to respond. I never heard someone even talk about something that to me sounded so silly, like believing in crystals or whatever it was." But then she thought of me in religion, and that again, little formative moments of it, just worldview changes. If that not worldview maybe, but maybe like a cultural view changes where I never thought that way. I never thought people could really think that way. When you're 14 years old, that's impressionable. Thinking, why would you associate me with crystals and what? But in her mind, because it's just, I guess, religious, whatever. But those are things that New Orleans, that school taught me a lot, that there are people from all kinds of walks of life. And
I think what you're saying is great on the impact that you can make when you don't even realize the impact you're having. I think on the other side of that, I look back on those high school days and I really think about what a better impact I could have had if I was living more faithfully. I mean, I was a but I wasn't vocal in my faith like I probably should have been. I think you were more so than I was. I mean, one of the things I probably looked up to you about, but maybe didn't imitate as much as I should have. But and I look back on those high school days, and going to high school in New Orleans was a real surreal experience. But I think about where some of those people are now. I was in a bowling alley in Gulfport, Mississippi, and they're playing music videos up on, the wall at the bowling alley. And I look up there and I'm like, I went to high school with that guy. He's now some rapper or something like that,
Wow.
So, I look back on it too, and I think you're 100% right. We often have an impact we don't understand, but I think if we take that for granted, we can miss out on the impact lots of people. And I look back with some regret on those high school days because I don't think I was living as faithfully as I should have. And I look back on a lot of those people and say, yeah, I probably missed a lot of opportunities to serve God faithfully then. God's good and he works through us in spite of us a lot of times, obviously.
Oh, Lord, yeah.
I think that cuts both ways. So
not as faithful. I hear you. No, I hear you. But well, thank you for having an impact on me, brother. I appreciate your friendship back then. I mean it. And your family was just anyway. So I look back when you back to, I guess, more. I have two different trains of thought. I would love to hear your thoughts on just very quickly when it comes to your specialty. What do you think your specialty academically it might be? And also I want to talk about some things about in the church, but academically, what do you focus on now? If you said areas or realms of your specialty, what would it be?
Yeah. So academically, I spent, I was especially when I got to PhD work, I was a New Testament major and Old Testament minor. So a lot of my work has been on the interrelationship between the two testaments, specifically quotations from the Old Testament and the New Testament. So I wrote my dissertation on Matthew's birth narrative.
Okay.
Looking at, there's 5 quotes in particular there, these fulfillment formulas, this fulfills what, the prophet said, these kinds of things, right? So a lot of my work was built off of an article by a guy by the name of Rick Watts. He was basically making the argument. So if you look at Matthew 7, if you look at Isaiah 7:14.
Isaiah 7:14, right.
And how it's used in Matthew is basically making the argument that you need to go back and understand the context of Isaiah 7 and 8 to understand how Matthew is using that quotation. So in other words, we tend to read that as Christians, Isaiah must have been predicting the birth of Jesus, right? And he's trying to make the argument, if you go back and look at the story of Isaiah 7, you have this whole story of King Ahaz and the prophet Isaiah coming to him. Ahaz is essentially worried these 2 kings are coming to battle against him, a sort of a coalition, Ephraim and Syria coming to battle against him. And so Ahaz is worried, and the message of Isaiah to Ahaz is basically, trust God, he's going to take care of you.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, if you continue reading into Isaiah 8, there's actually 2 references to Emmanuel in Isaiah chapter 8. But in Isaiah chapter 8, the references are negative. So in other words, Isaiah 8 says, God is going to judge you because if you read the story, Ahaz ends up trusting in Assyria instead of God. And so by the time you get to Isaiah chapter 8, the message is God's going to be with you to bring judgment. And so the whole story in Isaiah 7 is basically this call for Ahaz to trust God, to heed the sign of the birth of the child, as it were, and to place his faith in God. Ahaz doesn't do that, and so Emmanuel for him ends up being judgment in Isaiah chapter 8. So the argument that he was making about Matthew chapter 1 is that Matthew's essentially doing the same thing. He's saying to his readers, look at the sign of the birth of this child, right? Respond to the sign of the birth of this child with faith in God. If you do, right, God will be there with you. Emmanuel, God's presence will be with you. If you don't, God's presence will be with you for judgment. So that's sort of where I started off. And so I began to try to make arguments that effectively, that Matthew in particular is doing a couple of things. He's drawing to mind a larger story than maybe sort of just a proof text, if that makes sense. And he's drawing to mind that story to affect his audience in a certain way, to call them to faith in God, and also to warn them if they refuse to believe in God.
That's really interesting. I haven't ever heard that done that way as far as bringing up the possible for judgment. I was thinking of a couple things in response to that. One is, well, maybe a few things. One, let me throw this out there so I don't forget. One is, I'd love to hear more of your view of the notion of to fulfill. In what way is it a fulfillment? I'd love to hear your reflection on that, because um, a lot of podcast listeners already know my view, and maybe I'll talk about it after you respond. But I'd love to hear your view on what it means for a scripture to be fulfilled. The second thing is, I'd love to hear more on what evidence you think there is to believe that these larger stories are in view. I know it's a common kind of hermeneutical or exegetical move. Tom Wright and others do that all the time, that what's really in view is the larger picture of Abraham or the exile. Or we see this all the time, and a very common. I'm not teaching you. This is more my podcast listeners, of course, but just in case you're unfamiliar, it's very common with the so-called cry of dereliction of Jesus in Mark. So when he's quoting from Psalm, he's really evoking the entire Psalm. So that you get to the end of Psalm, he's really evoking victory and whatever. So this concept of the larger story, I have very mixed views on that. But the third thing is, and I'll just more of a comment than a question, and I'll go back and you can answer the other two. And that is my view of the Matthew, but you just alluded to it. You said an allusion, but I've never heard this or read it before. Now, Lord knows I'm not omniscient. There might be some commentators out there who have already said this, but I myself have never seen it that I know of, that I remember. And that is the reference to Jesus, to Matthew's editorial note, thus fulfilling, or thus being the Isaiah 7:14, that Emmanuel, that, the typical, absolute prototypical, you might even say quote unquote orthodox view, is that this is Matthew's way of saying Jesus is God with us. So the allusion to Isaiah 7:14 is about Jesus's divinity. I haven't found that persuasive in all my adult life, because that's not Isaiah's point whatsoever. And I do have the view, as I think probably most do, that Isaiah, when he when he says in Isaiah 7 about the virgin shall conceive, he probably is referencing his own wife, or the young woman. It probably is referencing his own son. I think that's the best understanding of Isaiah 7 and 8. Right. But the point is, he's not thinking his own son is divine.
Right.
And so when Matthew quotes it, I don't think Matthew. Now here's, and I'll give my caveat in a second. But if, and this is a big fat if, and I mean that, because when you read the New Testament, as you know, it's so interesting. That's you specialize in the Old Testament quotations. New Testament authors in general just don't give a rip about historical context. That's a hyperbole a little bit, but only a little bit. And so if Matthew cares about historical context of Isaiah, then what he cannot mean is that the Emmanuel means Jesus is divine, because that's not what he thought about the child in his own time period. But you just said, like you said, it's God's presence with us. That I find more persuasive. Yeah. That when we see Jesus, we're reminded that God the Father is present with us. And yet again, I don't know if that's unique, but I've never heard it.
There's a lot there. So let me start at the end and we'll work our way back.
Sure. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
A lot of good topics for discussion. So to start with, I am trying to make the argument, specifically as it relates to Matthew, but I would make the argument related to other New Testament authors as well, that they do care more about historical context than we tend to think. So in other words, if Matthew is saying, look, it was prophesied that a virgin was going to be born 700 years later, or whatever it is, right? 600 years later, then he is not caring about context. I'm trying to make the argument that he actually is caring about the context more than we've tended to think. So let's go back to the fulfill concept. I don't know your views on that. I haven't heard what you say on that. I addressed that some. Basically, I think I would make the argument that Jesus, in a sense, fills up to the full a lot of these Old Testament things. So you can look into that word. We could have discussions about the word pleroo, for example, but be that as it may, I tend to associate a lot of this with just the general consistency of the work of God throughout history. So in other words, is Jesus the literal fulfillment of Isaiah 7:14? I don't think Isaiah had that in mind for sure, but I think that Matthew is essentially trying to say that God is consistent in his actions throughout history. And so what he did in the Old Testament, he now does, but more through Jesus. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes. Makes sense. I mean, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that's where, again, we tend to take the word fulfillment as a sort of literal prophetic fulfillment. I tend to take it more as God is abundantly consistent in his work throughout history because he does not change in his nature and his character. So we ought not be surprised that the way God worked in the past is very consistent with the way God worked in Jesus, and then even into the present.
On Okay. On that particular thing, I think, yeah, I tend to think that, and I'm not certain on this. My view has been for quite some time that I like the idea of using the word analogy, almost like if I interviewed Matthew and said, Matthew, do you really think when Isaiah was speaking of this Alma Parthenos, in Hebrew or Greek, this young virgin, that Isaiah was speaking of Jesus? And if we interviewed Matthew for that, I don't know, if I'm not convinced Matthew would say, no, 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 he meant something different. I'm just using it a different way. I don't know exactly what he would say, but what I think he would say is, no, I don't think Isaiah was speaking of Jesus, but I'm using it as an analogy. That is, to the degree that that child in Isaiah's time was a sign of God's presence, of holding on, trusting him, so it is with Jesus. When you see Jesus, it's a sign that God the Father is with us, and he's got a message for us, and so forth.
Yeah, I don't think we're saying anything different there necessarily. I
Well,
think
well, good. That's interesting too. I mean, that's good. Good. I'm not at all looking for a place to disagree, but I think that's how I'd see it. The one thing about, I like how you're saying it shows God's work and God's consistency. For me, though, I would probably add the caveat, and you might agree or disagree with this, and that is to say, I'm sorry, I'm pausing because I'm thinking, how do I word this? That God is consistent in this very specific instance. It's the generalized nature that would make me nervous, because, I mean, as you know, that God doesn't do the same things
right.
as he does in the New
Right.
Testament. So I would say that Matthew would say he is consistent in this one area. That is, it's just like it. That's why I use the word analogy. That is, in this instance, God's being consistent.
Right. So yeah. So another way I talk about it sometimes is, like if you look at Mark 13, for example,
Mm-hmm.
you have this issue of the destruction of the temple and
Mm-hmm.
possibly end times judgment, right? That's the whole
Mm-hmm.
debate in Mark chapter 13. So the argument there to me would be, when God brings judgment, there is a consistency in how he tends to do so. It doesn't mean that every situation is exactly the same, but sort of, I mean, there's something parallel about the destruction of the temple and the end times judgment, I would argue at least, that is based on the consistency of God. So yes, I think you're trying to make the argument we can push that too far to say God does everything exactly the same every time. No, that's not the argument. But the argument is that there is a consistency to the nature of God. So the way a lot of people talk about this is typology, right? So in other words, one of the issues with typology is it forward looking or backward looking, right? So is the child in Isaiah 7 a forward looking type of Christ? And I think I'm trying to make the argument, well, it's really more of a backward looking type of Christ. In other words, Matthew is, I don't think, saying, see, this is the true intent of Isaiah 7 to predict the birth of Jesus from a virgin, right? I think he's saying that as we look back here, and I like your word analogy, here's an analogous situation, right? Here's a situation that's parallel to what happened, but even greater, because this is now about the Christ, not just a child born to perhaps Isaiah, right?
Yeah, I think I have this same view of that. I think that's helpful. And of course, as you know, and just to help my listeners, I mean, that's a very different understanding than, in my experience at least, of nearly every single preacher I've ever heard in my life, which is when you see the word fulfilled,
Yeah.
they think it was a future telling prediction of Isaiah or whomever is referenced in the text. And I mean, in course, scholarship, most people don't say that at all. I mean, that's just not, it's not the view at all. But in normal churchy life, it is. It's the idea. The idea then is that then you go back to the Old Testament, look for any single time it's a quote unquote proof text. And I, through the years, and I remember when this hit me, I don't remember the day and time, but I remember when it hit me too, how, whatever it was in my education, that this was the case, because it helped clear up for me why it was that, I'm sure your undergraduates and whatever still say this to you. Why didn't they see it? What was their problem? They had the Bible verses. They had their Bible the whole time. Why didn't they see that Jesus was going to be a Messiah who had to suffer and raise on the third day, and his name was going to be Yeshua? I mean, why? What's wrong with these obtuse dummies?
Right.
And of course, the answer is because they didn't, because they never thought those texts were used that way. They didn't. And moreover, when you look at texts that we call messianic, and then you read the Jewish texts, the Mishnah, the Targums, and so forth, in general, they disagreed. The texts they thought were messianic and the text that the early Christians would see as quote unquote messianic. And I use that in the broadest sense, like maybe even Isaiah 7:14 and so forth. They didn't read them that way. There's some overlap, but in general, they didn't. The point is, it seems to me, and I'm, maybe you too, but I mean, I know it's standard New Testament scholarship, that it was because of what we might call the Christ event that made them look backwards and go, oh, now I see it. Now I see how Jesus is like this, more than it was. If you simply read the Old Testament, you would expect to see exactly what we find in Jesus.
Right.
That's my view.
Right.
And that's another reason why, a little footnote, and I'll go back to that first question I asked you, but that's also why for me, in standard, apologetic works, like a Josh McDowell, whatever, and in my book I wrote on the Skeptic Challenge as a Christian, I exclude completely the sense of fulfilled prophecies. I just don't find that persuasive for that reason.
So I think, there's two different ways you can go off the rails here. And so in scholarship, the way I would say they're somewhat prone to go off the rails is to say that nothing in the Old Testament can be predictive, right? And so some of that is just sort of I don't know what word to use here, but among more liberal scholarship in particular, this, idea that there's no predictive prophecy whatsoever. And so I would push back against that to say,
I agree.
I'm perfectly comfortable with the Old Testament prophets being able to predict things. And quite frankly, Isaiah 7 is predictive prophecy. We're just making the argument it's shorter term predictive prophecy.
Right, sure.
So among scholarship, there's the tendency to go off the rails to say, in effect, nothing's predictive. And we can get into Isaiah 53, which I think points forward further than Isaiah chapter 7, but maybe that's a discussion for another day. Mm-hmm. So in the church, though, what I tend to see is, and this is sort of theology by meme, right? Jesus exactly fulfilled I don't know what the numbers are, but 300 some odd exact prophecies in the Old Testament or whatever it is, right? And that's where I push back on that side and say, I don't know. That's more complicated than that. I don't find it to be a particularly effective apologetic,
I like what you said. You said meme theology, where Jesus fulfills 300 something.
Meme, yeah, M-E-M-E.
Yeah, I like that.
Well, I like to joke that we do theology by meme today, which has a lot of issues.
That's so true. That's so true.
So yeah, I mean, I've never found that terribly convincing. And I think this transitions into the second question that you asked with, how do you know that the larger story is there?
Yeah.
Actually, while you were out, I'd pulled out my dissertation, which I don't look at with any regularity unless I have trouble sleeping.
You sleep under your pillow. I know.
Yeah. So one of the things that I tried to do, because I think that's a valid question, how do we know if the larger story is really there? How do we know if it would have connected with the audience? I use an example, and I don't even remember. It was from a book on the synoptic problem of all things, and they made this offhand reference to the emperor having no clothes, right? Mm-hmm. And so that kind of reference demands a shared narrative, right? A shared story. I have to know the story to get the point, right? Mm-hmm. And of course, if I said something about you, and that emperor didn't have any clothes, you wouldn't take that as a compliment because, I'm calling you something by doing that, right? Mm-hmm. But it matters that we both know the story. We both have to know the story. So that's a good question and a legitimate point. So one of the things I try to do as well is go back. And so I trace through Josephus and the Dead Sea Scrolls and into some of the Targums and different things like that. What was the story as it was understood in the time of Matthew in this case, right?
Mm.
How did the story of Isaiah 7 and 8 tend to be interpreted? There's actually an interesting discussion in Justin's dialogue with Trypho,
Mm.
where Justin kind of tries to make some of the arguments like are typically made about Isaiah 7:14 and sort of this literal fulfillment. And in this kind of dialogue with Trypho, it seems not to resonate with his Jewish dialogue opponent, right? Because that's not the way that he reads the story. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So I do think it's a legitimate question to say, how do we know if these larger stories are being referenced? And to that, we have to, I mean, we have to try to do some work and say, what was the shared story world of that time? How could Matthew have most likely anticipated his audience to have understood a quotation of Matthew 7:14?
I mean, of course, I agree. I think it's great. I think it's great to. I think what I find most convincing is what you just outlined, which is we try our best to figure out how people in the time period were exegeting certain passages. It's just that for me, I have yet to see. I mean, maybe there's a handful of, but in general, I have yet to see any convincing case where a biblical author, let's be real specific, say New Testament. Let's say a New Testament author alludes to an Old Testament text, or not to mention, Jude and First Enoch or other
Mm,
text, but
yeah.
any kind of ancient text from which they're borrowing, where they are making more than again, I just like the word analogy, more than the point they're making in the analogy. So, for example, if I can change it up a little bit, and maybe it's not fair to change it up, but to me, it seems to be fair to put these in a similar category. I often go back to the cry dereliction,
Mhm.
where people say that what really Mark's trying to get at is he ends up victorious because that's how the psalm ends. I mean, my gut is, that's just not persuasive to me at all, because if that's the case, why didn't Mark cite that? Why didn't Mark have the Roman centurion say, it's all good, we know he wins in the end? Or why didn't Jesus predict that before? That doesn't fit Mark's theology at all. And Mark, the passion predictions in Mark 8:31, 9:31, 10:33, 35, he never talks, he alludes on the third day rise again, but he doesn't emphasize the victory of it and its conquering. He just doesn't. It's not John's gospel. Instead, what he quotes, of course, is the suffering. And I interpret that to be something along the lines of, why didn't you rescue me?
Mhm.
And so to me, he's deliberately painting more Jesus' death as more of a tragedy, and there's suspense, right? Because there's suspense. He's praying in the garden, or not. It's not a garden in Mark. It's just the region. But anyway, he goes to Gethsemane, and he asks, "Not my will, but yours." But he does want the cup to pass from him. So there's always the chance that I like how, I think it was Rhodes who did the narrative study of Mark's gospel who helped me see this. I think he's exactly right. There's always a chance that Jesus could be rescued. So you never really know how God the Father is going to answer the prayer. You hope that it's going to be answered by the disciples sticking by his side and fighting off the people to come arrest him. That doesn't work. Then you hope it's going to be the religious leaders, and that doesn't work. And you hope it's going to be Pilate who lets him go. He almost lets him go. That doesn't work. And the last go-to is, of course, the Father on the cross. And C.S. Lewis makes a very similar point in Letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer. And the last resort, it also doesn't work. And so Jesus really did, it seems to be, by that quote, if you put in Mark's narrative, it fits perfectly that Mark is saying Jesus to the bitter end was hoping his prayer was going to be answered, and it wasn't. And he's sad about it. Sad. I don't know what an emotional state is, but he's certainly saying, why didn't you do it? I just find that so much persuasive. It fits the narrative. It fits everything well. But what doesn't fit to me is the idea that he ends on some victorious note. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, yeah.
So that's one example of it. I keep thinking, if Mark wanted to make that point, he would have cited that point. And I've heard people through the years go, well, that's what the rabbis would do. That they would allude to a verse when they really mean the whole thing. And my response is, where? I've looked up where do they do that? And I'm not talking about they reference a verse to reference a chapter, but to make a point, to make the point they're trying to make. In the New Testament authors, they seem to quote that exact verse, even if it is ripped out of context. When Jesus quotes from Exodus and says, when talking to the Sadducees about resurrection, don't you know your Bible? I am the father of he's of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that is of the living. But of course, that's not that's not the point in Exodus that he's talking about a resurrection. It's a very different point. But nevertheless, that one point is that verse he cites is to fit that one particular point Jesus is making. It's not to allude to the rest of the chapter of Exodus or to a grander narrative in Exodus. And I find that, and that's why in Matthew, my immediate response is, and maybe if I read your dissertation, which you can send me a free copy, I'll be persuaded to think, okay, what Matthew has in mind here is a greater narrative in mind. But I immediately think, well, if that's the point Matthew's trying to make, why doesn't he say those things? Why is it he only cites with us? Now here's my caveat, or not caveat. I'm just trying to show you what I would find persuasive, and I want you to tell me, talk to me more about this. I'm, of course, genuinely interested in your opinion. I would find it more persuasive if I'm still going back to the same point. If Matthew cited Isaiah, that passage, or any of those passages, with certain key words or expressions, and then those key words and expressions appeared multiple times in the text. Now, I'll give you one example of what I find more persuasive. Now, this isn't about Matthew per se, but for example, Jesus' citation of being the Son of Man, which I know can mean human and all that, and I get it. Right. But I, like most scholars, think that Jesus is at minimum, either he's assuming there's a title, one like Son of Man from Daniel 7, 13, and 14, or at least he's making it up. And I'm fine if he makes it up. I don't care. The point is, he sure seems to me to be alluding to that. Now, in those few verses, they're alluded to those exact phrases, coming with the clouds, authority having no end, and so forth. So when Jesus uses terms like, to show you the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, in Mark 2, I say to you, pick up your mat and go home. He's alluding to exact vocabulary, but he's only alluding to exact vocabulary in those two verses. If someone came to me and said, no, David, what he's really doing is alluding to the Son of Man in Daniel 7, 13, and 14, but he's really evoking the rest of the narrative of judgment coming upon Roman rulers and whatever, I just wouldn't find that persuasive. I guess I'm more, fine-tuned. I find more persuasive, if that makes sense. The farther we get away from exact vocabulary or even really close vocabulary, to me, it gets less and less convincing. And that's one reading things about Tom Wright's work that I usually find so unpersuasive is he says, Paul will quote, and I'll say this. I'm just doing a whole bunch of evidence out there, particularly my podcast listeners. This is, Charlie knows this, of course, already. But this is a very common thing that scholars do often, is to try to cite to say that he's really evoking a large part. But when Tom does this, I call him Tommy W. He's my butt. And I'm just kidding. So, N.T. Wright, who's a big figure, of course, he came to mind right off the bat because he loves to do this. He'll quote all kinds of things in Romans and Paul's theology and other things. He said what Paul really has in mind is this grand narrative of the Exodus when he's talking about baptism. And this really is about all through chapters 2, 3, 4, 5. And that's what a lot of scholars just stare at him and incredulity. We're like, we don't see it. When Paul quotes from the Old Testament, he actually quotes particular passages. He goes specifically to Hagar and Sarah. He goes specifically to Abraham in Romans 4. He goes, or in Galatians. You see what I'm saying? He goes specific. He almost quotes, he either tries to quote or alludes to, but it's that broader narrative that I guess I don't find as persuasive. I'm not inherently against it. At least I don't think I'm not consciously inherently against it. It's the issue of, I don't see the evidence as persuasive as it were to be if you had very specific vocabulary. Okay, so all that yap is done. I'll give you a chance to.
No. So there's a lot there. So let me say a couple of things. One of which is I'm not convinced by all that N.T. Wright says either. I had to read all his stuff going through. That was back in the New Testament People of God days, right? With his whole exile theme and all these different kinds of things. So, let me think through how to respond to that. So the first thing I think I would say is, just because Matthew does something in one instance doesn't mean that's exactly what he's doing in every instance. Right. So
good.
I think we have to look at each citation on its own merits. Right. So one of the things that we try to do is say, okay, every time the Old Testament is used in the New Testament, this is the way that it happens. But that just doesn't work. You have multiple authors, you have different contexts, all these different sorts of things. So in a sense, I'm with you to say, yeah, is there not a sense, and we just throw this wide open, and anytime there's a quotation, it means he's referencing the entire book or something like that? Well, no, that's not the point I'm trying to make. I do think that there has to be some controls on the sense, can I make the argument in this specific instance that that's what the author is doing? So I think we're in general agreement on that, maybe in some disagreement on specific passages and how far it goes, but be that as it may. So that brings to the point of, how do we tell in any one given instance, right? And I think we just have to look at the context. We have to, at bare minimum, I would say, though, and I think principally speaking, to go back to the exact fulfillment of 300 some odd Old Testament prophecies or whatever it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
I do think, especially in Matthew, that Matthew was fluent in the Old Testament and his audience was fluent in the Old Testament in a way that, quite frankly, we haven't been in the church in recent years. So that's one base level where I think Matthew can reasonably expect his audience to understand something of the context of these Old Testament quotations. In other words, when he cites Isaiah 7:14, I don't think if I cite Isaiah 7:14 in a church today, I'm not entirely sure how many people are going to know about the story of Ahaz there.
Oh,
right?
right. No one. Right.
I might have to explain that to him. I think, generally speaking, Matthew, writing for a Jewish audience, could expect more of a shared understanding of the context of Isaiah 7 and 8. So again, what you have to do is try to find what the shared story world is. So to your point, why don't they just cite it? I think, to make an analogy to the parables, right, there is something rhetorically effective about some ways of saying things, right? To go back to my example of the emperor had no clothes, that author could have simply said, sort of literally explain what's going on here, right? Here's a guy who thinks he's doing something great, but he's just being a fool or something along those lines, right? He could have just said that. But there's a rhetorical effect that comes with this brief allusion to a story that everybody understands. This is maybe somewhat parallel to the parables, right? Where Jesus could have just take the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? Jesus could have just said, hey, here's the moral of the story, right? But there's a rhetorical effect that comes through sort of building to this sort of climax and then changing the effect on your readers at the last second so that they say, oh, okay, here's where you were going with that, right? And so that is something that's remembered, far better than just, hey, let me explain to you exactly what I mean. This is a silly example, but thinking about Baylor reminded me, I went to my freshman year at Baylor. I lived in what they called the dork dorm at the time. And it was where, it wasn't where the cool kids lived.
How fitting.
Which shocked you, I know, right? But I still remember something a guy said. We're getting ready for flag football. And, we had a flag football team and we're having our first practice or whatever. And this guy says, man, what are we going to do? Beat them to death with our calculators. And so, I remember that line 20 some odd years later because it worked on a shared story that we're the dork dorm, we're going up against the better athletes. What are we supposed to do? And if he had just said, hey guys, we seem to have an unlikely ability to win these games because, we're not known for our athletic prowess or whatever.
Right.
I wouldn't remember that 20 years later, but I remember that specific line that briefly alluded to this shared story that we both held in common. And it had a bigger impact on me than if he would have just explained it. So those are the kinds of arguments that I'm trying to make. And again, you have to take all of that and apply it to individual passages and see, does it work in this instance? Because I don't want to claim that what Matthew did in Matthew 1:23 is what Mark had to have done in Mark 15 or whatever, or
right.
on and down the line. I would try to make the argument that it's what Matthew is tending to do in his fulfillment citations.
Gotcha. Good. And I'm still laughing about exactly that. That's good stuff. Yeah. I concur with you with almost all that. That is, of course, that's more memorable. I also concur that it's much more likely that they knew their what we call Old Testament a lot more than we do. I think I agree with those things. It just seems I'm still, I guess, stuck on the fact that Of course, just because those things are true does not mean, therefore, let me be real specific. Of course, just because Matthew's Jewish audience was probably quite aware of the Old Testament more than we are, of course, it doesn't follow from that therefore used the text the way that maybe you're suggesting.
Yeah.
They can be aware of it. It doesn't mean that's how they like to do their hermeneutics or their interpretation, their exegesis at all. It might mean that they know their Old Testament text and then go, yeah, but you have almost complete fluidity to apply it to however you want to. And I find that much more persuasive, because that's in fact what we do find all through the New Testament and the rabbinics material is that they do show an enormous amount of fluidity and patterns, and there are patterns. And for example, in Matthew, as just more from my audience, I know you know this, but in Matthew demonstrates a very common later rabbinic method, but Paul does the same thing, and that is, I can't remember now you might remember the Hebrew, the exact the name in the Hebrew, the technique where you basically chain up different words.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for example, if Mary's a Parthenos, she's a virgin, in Matthew's mind, it reminds him of another virgin, the Alma. That's Isaiah 7:14. Paul loves to join together word, grace, 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 or whatever it is. I know they're different people. The reason why I keep mentioning other authors is because that is a common pattern. And so what I have always found persuasive, what Matthew has done there, is he heard a word, and the word reminded him of another Bible verse, and he goes, yeah, it's like that. It's like that God the Father's with us, and he's the promise, and so we trust him. But to me, one is that's what he's doing, and two, that's enough. Like, that's the specific reference he's making is the words connect in his mind, and the point he's making is, I think, I agree with you, that it's God's presence. When we see Jesus, we see God's presence in his promise that deliverance is on his way. But that a virgin conceived. I mean, that's, to me, that's enough. So it makes his illusion. But so therefore, I'll just repeat it maybe again to make sure I understand what I'm saying. That is, just because they understand the Old Testament doesn't mean at all that's how Matthew or the biblical authors like to use their Bible. Or two, it also doesn't follow from that's how the audience would have assumed them. So if I time traveled and interviewed someone in Matthew's synagogue before they're Christian and asked them about interpretive practices, and go, if a Jewish teacher cites a verse, are you likely to, in your mind, evoke the entire chapter or a couple chapters from memory? Because I know you probably haven't read it before. You probably just heard it in synagogue. And do you think when they cite a verse, they're evoking all of it? I mean, based on what I see in the pattern of the New Testament, and based on my understanding of Jewish interpretation of what I've researched, and I'm not an expert in that exact field, the answer would be no. It depends on exactly what the Jewish teacher cites. That is, if he cites a verse or two, well, then we'll look at that verse too. But he would have the freedom to think God is fulfilling or using it in a way that he feels is good based on other rabbis. Mm-hmm. My major. So those are my two major points. One is just is how they would have used it in interpretation and how the audience would have understood it. But the other major thing is, I just still see a pattern overall, that there are patterns of exegesis and interpretation, like joining up words or joining up concepts that fit. What I don't find are different kinds of exegetical patterns, such as quoting a verse or two, but they're really citing the entire context.
Yeah. So again, I think in a sense we're in agreement on some of the analogy concepts. I think the disagreement maybe we have in reference to Matthew 1:23 is how far the analogy goes, if that makes sense, right? So, and I do think it's contextual. So to move to a different example, because you move to examples that make your point better, and so let me move to examples that make my point better. But
good. No, good.
So like in Matthew 4, in the temptation story, Matthew, so Jesus has 3 different Old Testament quotations there. Right?
Right.
So I think this is one of the better examples for me. Those all come from Deuteronomy 6-8. So I would look at that and say, okay, I think maybe that's not an accident, right? So there, I think, is a clearer example, whereas Jesus quotes from these, this limited context, but 3 different citations from Deuteronomy 6 through 8, like that's one indicator that's saying, okay, context is important here, right? That it's not an accident that he just, he's trying to draw to mind the wilderness wanderings there, and a parallel between the wilderness wanderings and what's going on with him in the wilderness and the temptation, all these different sorts of things, right? So that's where I think we need to be looking for clues that tell us, is there something more to this here? So I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you in principle, that certainly I don't want to make the argument that every time there's a quotation, again, I think we need some controls on there to say, we can't look at every quotation and say the whole book is meant. But I do think that sometimes, and again, I'm making particular arguments about Matthew here, that there are contextual indicators that Matthew, or Jesus in this case, is expecting his audience to understand more than just that verse. And I think the temptation narrative, with 3 quotes all coming from the same, rough area of the book of Deuteronomy, is one example of how that might work.
I think it's a fantastic example of something that I do find more persuasive. And so, I'm going to ask you in just a second, maybe you can dust off your dissertation or remember what are some evidences or some telltale signs that he is intending to allude to more of Isaiah chapter 8 and so forth. But Matthew 4 is a perfect example. I agree with you, very much agree. I know it's a standard view, but I find it persuasive that Matthew is deliberately, now I'm going to say Matthew, you might say, no, Jesus, but Matthew's Jesus, I think deliberately Matthew's Jesus, Matthew has framed the story such that it is, Jesus becomes the perfect, or rather at least the faithful Israelite. So instead of falling to the temptations of the wilderness experience, he beats them all. And so you look at the way they failed, Jesus succeeds. So they lose, they get an F on the report card, he gets A pluses. But I agree with that. I agree with that because all the references are from that passage. Two, the specific passages that are quoted are specifically about the issue at hand. So the bread to bread. Don't worship and worship. So the point is, these are it's almost quotations from it. In other words, it fits it because it fits it like a glove. It's not alluding to a larger narrative per se, but it's actually quoting from the exact wilderness experience. The other thing is there are words and phrases around it that also evoke that experience, like Jesus went into the wilderness and he's there for 40 days. And so we hear wilderness and 40. I think any Jew in their right mind goes, oh, our ancestors in the wilderness for 40. And of course they do. And so for me, you have both direct quotations, all from that same passage, and you have evocative vocabulary. Of course it is. I mean, it's that I find persuasive. So I do agree with for those reasons. Now, if a person said, and you didn't, but if a person were to say, okay, David, now if it is true that Matthew's Jesus is evoking that exact narrative and that's whatever, he also has in mind other things beyond the actual verses he quoted. He also has in mind that time the Israelites did X, Y, Z, and the time the Israelites were also faithful sometimes, but not faithful all the time. And remember that time when there was a pillar and cloud, but he's also evoking this, because it's also part of the grand narrative of the entire book or later chapters. And for me, I would say, I don't find that persuasive. It's like you've gone beyond the allusions. And then I would say, okay, I would say, what evidence do you have for that? What evidence is it that you're evoking all the other things beyond the actual quotations? And so that's how it is, I guess, with Matthew. So what is it in Matthew 1:23 that he's quoting or alluding to in that exact verse? Or is it peripheral things like my example of wilderness and 40?
Yeah.
I won't ask, sorry, I should act open-minded. Open-ended questions. I am open-minded. But maybe I should ask, so what are your evidence? So what are the things that evoke the rest of the chapter that help me see it better?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I think we're getting at the heart of the issue now. So in other words, and I literally scrolling back through some stuff right now, looking at some of the stuff.
Yeah, don't quote me on my stuff. Lord, I have to go back and read.
It's been a couple years, but
yeah.
I think just to briefly make the argument, I think some of what I tried to say was, if you look at Isaiah 7 and 8 as a whole, this is not a good story. Right. So in other words, Isaiah 7 and 8 as a whole function as a warning. So in other words, if you look at If you look at how the Dead Sea Scrolls treat these, or some of the Targums or different things like that, right? The Jewish people at that time don't go to the story of Ahaz and say, yeah, this is a great promise of great things to come in the future, right? The
Mhm,
whole
mhm,
story is a warning
mhm,
of, judgment if you reject the sign of the child. It's a, you look at what Josephus does with Ahaz, and Josephus doesn't have anything positive to say about Ahaz, right? This is a scoundrel and an idolater and all these different sorts of things, right? So in other words, I'm not now going to extra um, extra ideas for context in Matthew, but I'm going back to some Jewish writers from around that time saying that
okay.
basically this story was viewed in a negative light. It is a warning of what happens, right? So you have Emmanuel repeated twice in Isaiah chapter 8, right? So Isaiah chapter 8,
Mhm,
verse
mhm,
8 and Isaiah chapter 8, verse 10,
mhm,
both refer to Emmanuel again. It may not show up in all your English translations, but nevertheless,
mhm,
so the message of Isaiah 8 is God is with Ahaz to bring judgment, right? And that's the takeaway from Isaiah 7 and 8. Heed the warning of the story of Ahaz. Don't be like Ahaz, right? Because Ahaz rejected the sign.
mhm.
So there I'm trying to make the argument. This was the common understanding of the Ahaz story as it relates to Isaiah chapter 7 and Isaiah chapter 8. So that then leads me open at least to the possibility, and it may not convince you, and that's fine, but that leads me open to the possibility at least that when Matthew refers to Isaiah 7:14, that whole Emmanuel concept, because that's what the word is getting at, right? You will call his name Emmanuel. That whole concept of that story in Jesus's day, or in Matthew's day, really more specifically,
Mhm.
uh, is a negative story. It's a story of warning. And so that then allows me potentially at least, and we understand there's plenty of room for disagreement among, faithful believers here. But that then leads me to the possibility that by calling to this story to mind, Matthew would have expected his readers to think, okay, yeah, that Emmanuel sign, which ended up being ultimately the judgment of Ahaz.
But first off, that's I have never heard that in my life. That's fascinating. I mean, I really I love learning, and that's I have never done research on how ancient Jews were interpreting Isaiah 7 to 8, and that's just really cool to think about. I mean, I love learning new things. That's completely new to me. That's fun, man. That's really cool to think about. And then it really is. I mean, I appreciate that because I love learning. And the second thing I'd say is, what do you? So then, okay, all right. So let's assume for a second there was a general Jewish interpretive agreement that Isaiah 7 to 8 is a warning, and I like how you said that. Uh, so then the question is, why think Matthew is using it the same way? And then I had a second question. I'm going to stop there. So why? So there you go. I'll pause there. Why think Matthew is using it in that what seems to be a commonplace way to interpret Isaiah?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a good question. So then you're having to go out into the context of Matthew, right? And so you're looking out into the rest of the birth narrative and how he uses it. I mean, essentially, you're trying to establish, I would argue that you're trying to establish a pattern for Matthew's fulfillment citations in particular, right? So
Okay.
you get into the Magi coming, for example, right? And so then you're able to see if the whole principle is like, here's the sign of the child representing God's presence with us, right?
Mm-hmm.
How are you going to be an Ahaz, right? Or are you going to be an Ahaz? Or are you going to be what Ahaz should have been in essence, right? Then you have these kings coming, right? To, to see the sign of this child, right? And how do the kings respond to the sign of the child? Well, and so you're building out to the rest of the context of Matthew, and basically trying to make the argument there that Matthew is again dealing with the birth of Jesus as sort of the dividing line, if that makes sense, right? The ultimate sort of sign of the birth of the child representing God's presence with us, and how are you going to respond? And then that goes into a lot of what John the Baptist is going to say in Matthew, for example, where he calls out, you know, the people coming for baptism
Mm-hmm.
before him, the brood of vipers, who warns you to
Mm-hmm.
flee from the coming wrath, all these different sorts of things, right? And then even King Herod in there too, right? And how does King Herod respond to the birth of the child? So the argument there is we're building these stories that all relate to how do all these people respond to the birth of this child? which then leads me to reflect on what is my response to the birth of Christ, and how do I respond? Do I respond in faith, or do I respond in some type of self-reliance like Ahaz did back in the day?
That's really good. Of course, I don't think the Magi. I don't think they're kings, but I understand the point.
Well,
These
fair enough. That's fine.
astrologers, but no, that's a good. I really appreciate. See, to me though, that's good exegesis of the birth narrative of a theme, a Matthean theme of the various responses to Jesus, and we see that, of course, in all the Gospels, but certainly in Matthew, that they. Yeah, I mean that's great. I mean, I think the response is great. And I hear what you're saying. I'm thinking out loud for a second that it would be a warning of, if Isaiah 7:8 is the warning, there's warning of judgment if you don't respond to this sign of God appropriately. I guess for me though, I'm trying to, and that's interesting to think about Matthew trying to evoke a common interpretation. I guess my thought would be, why can't it just be the fact that that's Matthew's point, that Matthew just has the point in mind, but when it comes to that exact quotation, he's not alluding to all that. He's just alluding to the fact that a virgin will conceive, and when you see Jesus, you have God's presence. I guess I'm trying to, why connect that exact verse to that theme? Do we have to, or is it just an idea? Is that your argument in your dissertation, or even now? The argument is the argument basically Matthew's theme of the various responses of Jesus, like the Herod and all that stuff, comes out of his exegesis of Isaiah 7 and 8, and therefore they'll be judged?
I don't think I followed you on that. Sorry.
Is your argument that Matthew's theme of there are various responses to Jesus, and that they'll be judged, and the implication is they'll be judged if they respond negatively, like Herod and the chief priests and scribes and so forth? Do they get that? Does Matthew get that theme because he has exegeted Isaiah 7 and 8 and the common ancient Jewish idea that it's a warning?
Yeah. So I don't know exactly how to respond to that, but I think that, again, I think that Matthew is trying to make the point again, and I tie a lot of this to the consistency of God and his actions throughout history, that that God tends to work in similar patterns, which we've already talked about that a little bit. Mm-hmm. But I think again, a lot of this does come down to what Matthew is doing. And so your argument, maybe help me understand your argument, and that'll help me respond a little bit better. So your argument on Matthew 1:23 is essentially just, hey, here's another child that's been born that represents God's presence. Jesus represents God's presence. That's essentially the point of the quotation. Am I understanding you right on that?
Yeah, that to me, that's it. Maybe at minimum and maybe at maximum. That is, to me, I find that very persuasive. Yeah, that's right. So I find that persuasive. I'm not saying that there can't be any other point to it. It's just that to me, that is, the obvious interpretation.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying it's the exclusive, right? It's not, it doesn't mean it's an exhaustive interpretation. It just means at minimum, surely he means that. Surely Matthew has linked together these two words, Isaiah, virgin. Though I know it's different in Hebrew and Greek, and atheists get this wrong all the time. He wasn't even a virgin. No, they don't anyway. So I'm not talking about that. He's at least to link together one word, and his point still stands that when you see Jesus, you see God's promise that God the Father is with us. So when you see him in his ministry, you realize that's it. The kingdom of God is with them. God's presence is with them, and so forth.
Gotcha. So let me ask you this question, and maybe it'll help me develop my argument a little bit further. So then, in your understanding, why does Matthew say this fulfills what was spoken through the prophet?
Because of Matthew's theology. I think it fits Matthew's view of Jesus. Namely, Jesus wasn't just a dude. That Jesus was a walking representation of God, I'll say God the Father's presence amongst the people. Like the image of God represents God amongst humans versus animals. And when you see a human, you've seen the image of God, much like when you see Jesus, they're supposed to see God's with us. God the Father's with us. And the implication is his message is true. The implication is when he exorcises demons, he's not evil. Implication is when he heals people, he's trying to restore, that kind of stuff. So I
Yeah.
think it
So
fits Matthew's theology.
yeah. So I think what I would say there then is, I think I'm trying to make the argument that, again, so again, we're talking about the context of Matthew now, but Matthew is very deliberately using these fulfillment formulas, which I would make the argument is causing his audience. This is another contextual clue, I think, for my argument. He doesn't always use a fulfillment formula, right? I mean, sometimes he can just refer to an Old
Mm-hmm.
Testament text or
Mm-hmm.
allude to something.
Mm-hmm.
So here I'm trying to make the argument that this fulfillment formula in particular is sort of a flashing light, screaming to his audience, pay attention closely to this one, right? Like, something's coming that you need to understand. And so I'm trying to make the argument that Jesus sort of fills up, to use the language I used earlier, Isaiah 7 and 8, that he is, and I don't know if we would disagree here now, that he is sort of the ultimate fulfillment of that, right? So in other words, if the birth of the child and, Isaiah's child or whatever, it's not actually relevant for my point. If the birth of that child was a sign, then even more so, like, Jesus is the ultimate, sign that you need to respond to, that he's filling it up in that sense, right? And so that to me would be another contextual clue where he's using these fulfillment formulas to basically highlight to his audience, pay attention to this one. Something's coming up that you really need to understand very closely. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like, yes, I feel like we're on the same page. I just keep thinking, but why go the next step? Why go any other step from that? So, for example, and the reason why, again, he quotes Isaiah 7:14, he doesn't quote Isaiah 8.
Right.
Had he quoted from Isaiah 8, I think you'd get me. You'd say, no, I'd say I'm with you, Charlie, just like back to your Matthew 4 references. He quotes from those.
Yeah.
And so he doesn't quote from Matthew 8. Isaiah 8. He quotes from Isaiah 7. And since he quotes from Isaiah 7 and Isaiah 7, it's not one of judgment or even the threat of judgment. It's, hold on, Ahaz, God's with you. God's with you. God's presence is with you. God, whatever. God can be trusted to be good. If he's with you. And that's, we'll put that into a name. Emmanuel. He's with you. And I think I think that's all Matthew's point is. When you see Jesus, God's with you. But if he did allude to us, so why do I need to evoke? And then you're going to say, well, Emmanuel is also mentioned twice in Isaiah 8. Right. Well, the word is, but not the verse.
Matthew doesn't quote the verse, right? And I'm making the argument Matthew doesn't have to quote the verse. And this is where we may just agree to disagree on this. And I'm not, I'm not going to, it is what it is. I mean, these are the kinds of struggles we have in hermeneutics and interpretation.
Oh, right? Lord, yes. Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. So we're having a conversation that is a good conversation to sort of struggle through some of these things. So my argument would be, again, Matthew doesn't have to quote from Isaiah chapter 8 because his audience understands the rest of the story, as it were, right? So we're even talking about, well, Isaiah 7 says this and Isaiah 8 says this. That's already building in an artificial distinction between Isaiah 7 and Isaiah 8, right? It's all one story. Right? There's no chapter division there in a sense, right? So that's my argument. It is all one story, right? And the end of the story is what? Judgment on Ahaz because of his faithlessness, right? So I would argue that if you understand, and this goes back again to my argument that Jewish people at that time tended not to interpret this whole story of Isaiah 7 and 8 in a positive light, that the end of the story is God's judgment on Ahaz for rejecting the sign, right? And so, I don't know. I mean, we're obviously well within our rights to disagree on this, and I mean, I'm not surprised that it's this. I think it's a hard case to make in a certain sense, but I think that's my general argument is Isaiah 7 and 8. We can't separate the two things. It's a story. That matter of fact, the title of my dissertation was The Story Behind the Story, right? That it's a story that Matthew is calling to mind for a rhetorical effect in order to drive a point home to his audience. So, I mean, if that's unconvincing to you, that's fine. I mean, I certainly get it. But I think that's the overall argument that I'm trying to make is, and this is where I have some sympathies with N.T. Wright on this particular issue, obviously, is that there is this, some people call it narrative dynamics or metalepsis, basically where you're calling to mind a broader concept through an allusion or reference to one part of that story, right? And I think we do that all the time. I think, and I've tried to give some practical examples of how we do that. Um,
It's just, and I completely agree with that part. My concern always with any modern example is I'm always thinking, yeah, but how do you know they did that? So absolutely we do it. Of course we do. I mean, yeah, and back to your analogy you gave earlier of, what was it now? Because now I keep thinking of calculators.
Beat him to death with a calculator.
But the example you gave before about the
the emperor has no clothes.
Yeah, right. Absolutely, and of course, that evokes an absolutely, and we absolutely. I mean, I completely agree with that. My question always is, great. How do we know that's what the New Testament author was doing in that instance, or how do we know that's what ancient Jewish authors did?
And I don't. Yeah, I don't think I can answer that question in a way that's going to demonstrably prove it for you. What I would, and I get that, trust me. What I would say is, so let's say I'm coming to preaching Matthew chapter 1, for example. This is where we get into biblical theology, where I think I would make an argument that in preaching that text, I don't know that it matters that much. Because if I begin to do biblical theology and assume sort of this consistency of the nature of the action of God throughout history, then as I preach a text like Matthew 1, and I don't know if we'd be in agreement on this or not, that whether or not Matthew intended that, that I can bring that passage to bear on my audience as I preach the text of either Isaiah 7 and 8 or Matthew 1 for that instance. So I don't think I necessarily have to prove that Matthew did it to make the larger point that as Christians today, we need to know Isaiah 7 and 8, and we need to hear that message of warning that God gave to Ahaz. We need to look at Ahaz as the negative example, and we need to say, no, we need to trust God in the midst of dire situations, right? So I think that whether or not I can convince you of that, I think there's still a larger point to be made. Sort of it relates to the theology of the passage.
Amen. I completely agree with what you just said. And to me, that I would make, if someone asked me, and I won't do that right now because I want to go back to a couple questions I have. If someone said, David, why is that okay to make the theological point? But I would argue for that. I think there are reasons to make the argument based on multiple themes and traditions in the New Testament, that the point that we should respond, that how you respond to Jesus matters, that when you, I mean, on and on, I think that's an easy argument to make, that it fits perfectly into what I would call an overall, it's a scary word, New Testament theology. And if you're just a listener, I mean, that's hard to make a theology of anything at all, because the biblical authors have such different, but I think that's an easy argument to make, that would be a solid theological point to make in a sermon. Completely agree. What I find intriguing, and I'm sure as you do too, obviously, because my bread and butter was more New Testament studies before I switched over to historical theology, and it's still where my heart is. I just love the intriguing thought of, what was Matthew thinking? What was Matthew thinking? What was his audience thinking? And that's, of course, and this discussion has helped me and is exciting for me, because I like thinking of those questions. I'm not sure why, but I'm weird and I'm a dork and I do. So I think Matthew would agree. I think Matthew would hear the sermon, you and I, particularly you, would preach on that. And I think you'd say high five. But the question is, Matthew, was that what you were thinking when you quoted from Isaiah 7:14? And that's a different question. Is that what you were thinking when you quoted that verse? And in my view so far is, I'm not sure. I don't think so, but I'm not sure if that's what he was thinking. But can I make a theological point that we should? And I think he would say, yeah, it's a good theological point. I think he might go, oh, that was a good one. I think about that. I don't know. But for the reason I said, which is he quotes from exactly as Isaiah said 14. He doesn't quote from the other. But two, also, when you look at the story, there are the two things about the story, and I'm done. Just showing, again, just conversing. The other thing is, when it comes to, I completely agree. Of course, there's a broader story about that Ahaz narrative. Absolutely. But then I would say is, it just seems to me that's an easy, not slippery slope, but makes all of us, both of us, I'm sure, concerned when it comes to every single time a New Testament author quotes the Old Testament. You can always say, well, there's a story behind there. What it really means is, and then there's a bigger story, and then there's the prophetic story, and it just gets, to me, I don't know where it stops. I don't know where the boundaries are. Of every time there's always a story in the background, we can always make it say, well, this is what he really meant, or this is what Paul was really thinking, or Jesus was really thinking, or John was really thinking, because there's a broader story. And if we're just asking the question, what were they thinking? What were their goals in mind? To me, that's why I start going, I don't find that persuasive unless I start seeing actual allusions or quotes from the words and the concepts right then and there. Again, I've already given examples like the cry of dereliction in Mark 15 and other passages. Unless I do keep thinking, if they wanted to talk about the whole story or the whole psalm or the whole whatever, they would cite it. But they don't. They use those exact verses, it seems to me, for their purposes. And so that'd be one concern I have, is that if the fact that there is a story is the evidence, then I would say, well, then I would love to hear more, as you said earlier. I think you said rules. I can't remember the word is. So that's one concern. The other thing is I keep thinking about over and over is, first off, where I completely agree. I mean, anybody, audience listener, this is standard New Testament biblical scholarship, Old and New Testament scholarship. Whenever we try to find out what an ancient author was thinking, which is a scary thing, and I mean, not metaphorically, and not getting psychology of Matthew, but basically, what was their intent? We do, of course, go to the ancient sources that we have. We have a lot. I wish we had a lot more, but we can cite things. We can go to various biblical, ancient, basically you might call them Bible commentaries, like the Targums and later on the Mishnah. The problem with that is, when it comes to the Targums particularly, and the Mishnah and Talmud as well, is that our earliest manuscripts come from centuries. I mean, real like, a millennia after the fact. So they're very, very, very beyond when they were written. But most scholars do think the Targums nowadays, these Bible commentaries basically, and then they're kind of like a commentary. They're like an Aramaic paraphrase that ends up being commentary. We can trust them. They used to be dismissed in scholarship, but now we think they're a little more trustworthy because we found the Targums being quoted in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we can date with certainty to the time right before Jesus. So the point is, we have some Old Testament, we have some Jewish documents that seem to give commentary on various Bible verses. Not on every verse. Wouldn't that be cool if we had commentaries on every single Old Testament Bible? But we don't. Bible book, but we don't. But we have some. And so just like Charlie's talking about, we can go back and cite these things. Then we have Josephus and other things, and that's wonderful. The question always is, so first what I'm saying is, what most scholars find persuasive is if you say, what was Paul thinking? What they do is go, well, first off, how does Paul use that word or the concept in this document and then every other document, at least the undisputed? Or what did Matthew think? How does he use these words in Matthew's gospel? Like in Matthew's concept of righteousness, it's a little different than Mark, Luke, and John. His concept of dikaiosune is a little different. But how do we know that? Well, we read Matthew very carefully. We look up every single time the word dikaiosune or righteousness is used. And then we cite it and we look at the ancient Jewish Bible commentaries, and we say, how do they use these concepts? And then we say, put all this evidence together and go, it seems like Matthew meant this. It seems to be this how he's thinking. Here's the problem. The problem is we can find some Bible commentaries and Targums and Mishnah, whatever, that have a consistent biblical interpretation and know for a fact that the New Testament author disagrees with them. And for me, one of the most poignant examples of this is Paul. In Romans chapter 4, when Paul uses Abraham's faith as what is credited to him as righteousness, goes against every single ancient Jewish interpretation of Genesis 12. Every single Jewish author of the time period for which we have evidence. When they go to Abraham as an example of faith, they say it was his works, the fact that he offered up Isaac. That's what's credited as righteousness. And Paul disagrees. Paul says, no, it was his faith alone, that is just trusting God was going to take care of him. My point of that is, that's one example where, and that's a big example to me. I call it a big example. I guess it's big to me. I use the word adjective big because Paul uses it, and I think in powerful and important parts of his argument in Romans 4 and in Galatians, that see our own Bible. This, he didn't say fulfilled, but this is just like when Abraham and his faith was credited as righteousness. If I go back to all the Jewish authors, I mean, that really stood out to me when I first learned that years ago. I thought, man, that really is powerful, because that also helps me understand why Jews in the time, fellow Jews in the time of Paul's preaching, would have been so ticked off at him and confused. Right. Paul, what are you smoking? We all know that that's not the point of Abraham's story. The reason why he was a righteous, that is, in that sense, faithful to his you might say covenant with God, is that he offered up his son. It's not because he believed him. It's not because he trusted him. It's because he did something. He had behavior behind it. And Paul said, no, that wasn't the point. The point is they're disagreeing on exegesis. So that's one of other examples that come to my mind that give me pause. And that's why my response is twofold. And just to repeat it shortly, one, yes, I find it most persuasive when you have a consistent ancient Jewish Bible interpretation. And I can give you an example that support, and one that support there, that helps with that. But then there are examples like the one I just gave with Paul that fly in the face of that. So that means I always have a question mark. So when someone like yourself and says, when Matthew has in mind is the story, and there's a consistent ancient Jewish interpretation that this is a warning, my immediate question is, well, how do you know Matthew's using it the same way? And I'm not saying you said this, but of course, just because if you had 50 ancient Jewish authors saying, we should all interpret Isaiah 7:8 this way, it doesn't mean Matthew did. Look at Paul. Look at other people who say, no, they just, that's not the point I'm making.
Yeah.
So I completely agree with you. I find it more persuasive, much more likely. It's much more likely that Matthew's not being unique to me.
Yeah.
To me, it's much more likely that Matthew's interpretation of Isaiah 7-8 fits into the Jewish cognitive environment. I find that much more likely. And that's why your argument to me is much more persuasive when you say, well, it's also in Josephus and the Dead Sea Scrolls and the whatever. I go, well, that's to me, that's meaty. That's good stuff. But I still go, how do you know he's using it the same way?
Right.
Because that's a different issue. And you see my point?
Well, so
I'm not
there's
trying
a
to be
lot
verbose.
No. So there's a lot there. So let me kind of walk back through. So your first point was, how do we limit this? And I think that's a completely fair point, right? So I like the way you said it. That there is a broader story is not evidence of an allusion to that story, right? So I think that's perfectly fair. And so part of me trying to make arguments for a possible allusion there. So I'm with you on that. And there's a lot more that could be said there, but I think we're in fundamental agreement on that. So then the question becomes, and I think this is another really good point: do we allow the New Testament authors to be unique? I think that's a great point. Even so, if you look at a lot of studies of Greco-Roman culture, for example, and how that relates to Paul, I have some issues with some studies that say, see, this is what the Greco-Roman culture did. This must affect how Paul was speaking, right? What if Paul disagreed with them?
Amen.
So I'm with you there. So to me, it comes back to, this is where the purpose of the citation matters. So let me flesh this out a little bit.
Okay.
So in Galatians, for example, so Paul is dealing with this, Judaizing controversy, right? The false teachers have come into Galatia and he's battling against them, the men who claim to be from James, all this sort of stuff, right? Mm-hmm. So why is Paul using the Genesis 15:6 citation there? And I think he's using it to and I think I agree with everything you said there, right? He's battling against the common Jewish interpretation of the day, right? So he's saying, no, it's always been about faith, right? Even making the point that, Abraham's, being credited righteousness comes before his circumcision, right? Mm-hmm. We can look at that. So I'm with you on that. So one of the arguments that then I would have to make, so now let's go back to Matthew and begin to make the point about, okay, why is Matthew using these citations? And so it would matter to me here whether, so take the purpose of Matthew, for example. Is Matthew mostly writing to Jewish Christians who've already been convinced of Jesus as the Messiah? Or is he writing to Jewish Christians who are unconvinced, sort of as a more of an evangelistic purpose, if that makes sense, right? Mm-hmm. So even that would matter in a sense. So we have to begin asking the question, who's the audience that is being addressed in this case? And, if we can tell anything about the audience, which sometimes we have better information than others, obviously, how does the audience affect how Matthew would be using that text, right? So a different audience in Galatians versus a different audience in Matthew might affect how that New Testament author is bringing the Old Testament to bear. Whether he's making the point that he's disagreeing with the common Jewish interpretation of the day, or he's actually building off of the common Jewish interpretation of the day.
Okay, so motivation. You there?
Yeah, yeah.
So you're saying motivation for you would be one of the things that would not be a, I don't know a better expression, but slippery slope.
Well, I think it's part of it. So again, ultimately, we're asking the question, what is Matthew trying to do here, right? What's his purpose in doing this? And that ties into the purpose of his book to begin with, right? And there's lots that can be written on this, so we don't have time to get into it, right? But
Yeah.
there's a difference of opinion on whether or not Matthew has written sort of again to Jewish Christians, or as sort of an evangelistic gospel for Jewish people who haven't trusted in the Messiah. So my argument, and being kind of blunt here, I guess my argument I think works better if he's writing to sort of with some of the purpose at least to be for non-Jewish believers with the hopes that they'll trust in the Messiah, right? And in that case, that would be a point of contact for him and his audience that, they would have understood Matthew 7 and 8 in this, Isaiah 7 and 8 in this way. I want to build off of that to point you to Christ.
Gotcha. Yeah. So, gotcha. Okay. Yeah. 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 To me, well, to me, I'm not against making a cumulative circumstantial case. My goodness. I mean, and especially, New Testament studies, so much of it is, I'm not against that. To me, the farther, how do I say that? I've never been forced to describe this. The farther away I get from the text, to me, it's more tenuous, because then you would have to, well, it's like probability, right? So you have to make it more probable than not that
That's
he's
right.
writing for the motivation you just said. Well, that's a whole argument. And you had to make probable than not, then then probable than not, and if not, ends up being the house of cards. So if you take a 1 or 2 or 3, ends up being like Richard Carrier, Jesus never existed. Well, if you assume,
Right.
James didn't mean his literal sibling, but his brother in Christ. And if you think this, and if you think, well, now we're 30 ifs into it, and I don't find that, then it just becomes just a mountain. Well, yeah, if that's all true, then that's convincing. And that's why, for me, I'm just saying what I find. Lord Jesus, I'm not the arbiter of truth, but I'm just in conversation. That's what I find more persuasive when it comes to the exact illusions.
I get
I'll
that.
stop there. Go ahead.
No. I get that. And that's where I think, again, we could go round and round on this all day and have a lot of fun with it, but we may leave thinking exactly the same thing we left going into it. Right. And that's fine, but we've both been challenged, on our views.
I love the idea of thinking of that background Isaiah 7:8 as being a warning, and at least tying into the theme of, well, okay, I use the word theme. I use the word theme because I see a pattern, and that is a pattern in Matthew that when person meets Jesus, either literally or they hear about his message, their response is quite divided.
Yeah.
And the people you would think to be the people on his side, like Jewish leadership, are not. And of course, King Herod is not, but other people are, all the way to the bitter end, when there's always divided. So I think that is, I think a persuasive argument can be made that is a theme in Matthew's gospel. And so therefore, if it is the case that Matthew is evoking Isaiah 7 and 8, it sure fits a theme. I would find that persuasive, that it fits the theme. But what I'm still on the fence about is whether or not that's exactly what's going on in his exegesis of Isaiah 7:14, as he quotes it just there.
Yeah.
And that's a different, I mean, maybe it's a subtle difference, but I guess not subtle differences. That's your dissertation.
Well, so I think the point is, I think we're both concerned over, and this is actually a hot topic of debate right now on sort of things like sensus plenior and
Right.
multiple fulfillment and all these different sorts of things. And I mean, goodness gracious, that's a whole other topic in and of itself, of course, which we probably don't have time to get into. But this is where I do come back and say, we do have to keep in mind, and so I would put it this way. that I do think that ultimately the Old Testament is pointing forward to something, right? And so I think the New Testament authors are saying, this is what, to the Jewish people in particular, this is what you've been longing for, right? This is what we've been hoping for.
Mm-hmm.
And we're recognizing it's not coming in exactly the way that most of them expected it, for sure, right?
Mm-hmm.
But they're trying to say, this is the fulfillment of our hopes, right? This is God's great work, where he is doing all the things that he promised he was going to do, right? He's keeping his promises to David and to Abraham and all these different sorts of things. And Matthew has plenty to say about that. So again, I think there's this whole element where, yes, I tend to be a roughly speaking, an authorial intent kind of guy, though that's a complicated question. I believe that God is part of the authorship too, right? So there's that issue. But I do think we need to understand Matthew with the perspective that Matthew is trying to say to his audience that this is what we've been hoping for all along, that the Old Testament story is filled up in Christ, whether that's the story of the wilderness wanderings, right, which we see in Matthew chapter 4, or whether it's, Isaiah and Ahaz and this birth of the child that now is even, something far greater than that has happened in Jesus, right? So that's where, and I don't think we're probably in fundamental disagreement about that, but that's where I think that from Matthew's perspective, he's trying to communicate to potentially even an unchristian Jewish audience, in some context at least, this is what you've been longing for, right? This is, broadly speaking, what the Old Testament has been pointing forward to, even if we're not saying that Isaiah 7:14 specifically pointed to the birth of Jesus hundreds of years later.
I agree. I mean, I think you just articulately said exactly one of the major themes and purposes in Matthew writing his gospel. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. From me, I don't, and I'm not saying you're doing this, I'm just in conversation. I don't go from the point you just made, with which I fully concur, and see, therefore, Matthew must have meant X, Y, Z because he quoted Isaiah 7:14. Because I don't work backwards from theme to this, what he means in this verse. I would find it more persuasive if you had, again, I'll stop there. That's the point I don't go. So I think the theme is there, absolutely. I'm not sure if Matthew 1:23 is used to fit that theme about the warning and so forth as it is. It does fit the theme that God is with us and he does fulfill
God's presence, right?
In that sense, and like at minimum, I find that persuasive. But this is good, man. Well, we'll wrap up here. I don't want to. I want to ask you, but also I would love to hear a lot more of your thoughts on, and maybe you can fix me and correct me on. I've done podcasts on inspiration and inerrancy, and I get questions from people about that, and I would love to hear your thoughts on that, especially working at a university where aren't you required to sign a document that says it's an inerrant and so forth?
Yeah. So the Baptist Faith and Message for one, and then we have another statement of faith too.
Gotcha. And I would love to hear, well, what your views are, and then secondly, how you put that together with what Charlie said was authorial intent. That's when we read the text, in particular when it comes to, that's more of a faith issue, but it's even just a straight up exegesis. So a Jew could say the same thing. Well, they do. I mean, Amy Jill Levine at Vanderbilt, who's a Jew and whatever. But in biblical scholarship, when we talk about authorial intent, it's looking at how do we interpret a text. And so authorial intent is controversial because a lot of people say you don't know it at all. Well, postmodernists and deconstructionists said there is no such thing as authorial intent. Mm-hmm. All that matters is how I feel and my perception of it. And I don't find that anyway. I mean, I hear some of it, I get it, yeah, but I overall think it's nonsense. But others say it's controversial because we never know exactly what they meant. But in general, most biblical scholarship for the last 150 years has assumed that in large part the best way to interpret a text is figure out what they meant. And how do we figure out what they meant? Well, by reading it very carefully and reading that biblical text inside the ancient world, whether it be Jewish, Greco-Roman, and whatever. So what Charlie's alluding to, of course, I would love to hear, and I agree. I mean, I agree with you too, that I think in large part that is the best way and the most commonsensical way, in my opinion, to interpret any text, no matter what it is, including the Bible. Where things get very hairy, it seems to me, are people who use words like inerrancy and inspired, like you just said, that God's still speaking. I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on, how you navigate that world, how you put those together, and
Yeah.
and exactly what's inspired. Is Matthew's exegesis inspired? Is his hermeneutical moves, and on, and all kinds of Bible verses. I would love to hear more of that, and also hear more on some other things. I would also at some point, because I know you've been a pastor, you were a pastor for a long time. I'd love to hear maybe an upcoming podcast on your views of the challenges facing the church, the American church as you see it.
Mm-hmm.
And I have my opinion, but I'd love to hear your view on that, being in the trenches for so long. And also I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on common, I guess, maybe themes or reflections on students these days.
Mm-hmm.
And it could be negative or positive, or, both. Just your reflection on the state of, well, like you said, how much memes carry so much theology. I mean, that's just a very good way of saying it. And you learn a lot. I've taught at a college and taught at a high school too for a while, and to teach. But you really do get kind of the generations change. You get kind of a flavor of where people's hearts and minds are, and of course denominations are different and what. But I'd still be really curious from your perspective as professor now again, to hear reflections on your take on the current state of.
Yeah, there's cycle. And just to say briefly, I guess I'm teaching next week a hermeneutics class, and so I've been thinking through a lot of, we deal with history and interpretation some, and one of the really interesting things is to me has been, I mean, we do go through, I don't know if cycles is the right way to talk about it, but it's been interesting. So you look at like the Middle Ages, for example, and you're, I'm sure, much more of a historian than I am, but just broad speaking patterns where you have tons of allegory, for example, church tradition carrying, weight, papal authority, all these different kinds of things, right? Where you have these massive controls on it. It's weird where while you're using these allegorical methods, you also have sort of church tradition restraining those, if that makes sense, right? And then you end up with these popes who have, too much authority. We lead into the Reformation and all this kind of stuff, where, now we want to have the Bible in the hands of everybody, and everybody can read and interpret it from themselves, which is great. But then we end up in the modern era where everybody's meaning and interpretation is just as valid as everybody else's, right? And so, I mean, you look through sort of the history of what's going on in the church, and we have to find sort of a middle ground where, on the one hand, yes, I believe that everybody should be able to go to and read and interpret scripture. But I'm also trying to make the claim you can be very much wrong in your interpretation of scripture.
Right.
But how wrong you are matters in a sense, right? So in the debate we're having right now, in this particular case, I don't think it matters that much if either one of us is wrong on the nuances of the interpretation.
I agree.
Right? But there are some things that you can be wrong on that actually really do matter, right? And would put you in the category of a heretic or an unbeliever, even possibly, right? So it's complicated. And so, I mean, I love having conversations like that, but, and it's a hot topic right now, but in a sense, we have to find a way to say, yes, scripture is clear. And I don't have any issues with using terms like inspiration and inerrancy, though what people mean by those terms is not always the same.
Right.
So sort of the clarity of scripture, that God speaks through his word, and he speaks to us through his word, but also we have to balance that with the implicit understanding that I'm a frail, broken, sinful human being, and I can completely misunderstand it to a very dangerous point. So there's a ton of stuff we could talk about there. Very topics, though, I think. So.
Well, I amen, brother, and I really would like to hear it, particularly because I mean, just obviously being a friend, but also it's intriguing to me from your. I'm not making presumptions. That's why I don't want to make. I mean, there's a little. I think it's safe to say presumptions that your theological training was a bit different from mine. Sure. I didn't have a radically liberal education, but I mean, I didn't go to a Southern seminary. I mean, a Southern Baptist seminary. So I suspect some of your training was a good bit different, which I assume some of our theological views might be different. And I would love to hear your take on that. But simultaneously, I mean, that's one reason why, but also because, like you and people who know me, of course, and podcast listeners know that, but like you and like me together, I mean, we're disciples of Jesus. We take this very, very seriously. And I think that's one of the great benefits of a podcast like this and you teaching is I want my listeners to be able to hear this amongst brothers in Christ who take their faith very seriously, imperfectly, but serious enough to say, these are the wrestles and the struggles. And that Christians ought to join the discussion. You keep thinking about these things, not be afraid of that versus this is not a novel observation. The point is, instead of just calling each other names and yelling at each other and then never talking to each other again, why do that?
Yeah.
Why? I mean, we can do better than that. And I think it's a struggle worth having. I think trying to figure out what Matthew meant and how to interpret. I think that stuff is awesome. I mean, it's worth having the thoughts and discussion and outside of specialists. And outside of specialists, most people don't like to talk about it for various reasons, but I'm different. And I feel like one of my chief callings in life, C.S. Lewis said his was to basically translate the Christian message to non-believers. I feel like maybe one of my chief callings in life and my ministry calling is to help bridge the academy between the academy and the church, to bridge that gap. And I want to be able to help, you might say, translate scholarship to the average person in the pew who wants to, what does this mean? And how do I live like Jesus more, and so forth. And that's it. Having said, in other words, it's functional, but having said that, just, I'm a nerd. I don't want to, everything I think and come to the conclusion, I don't want to be how do I preach it? Of course, but the background work matters. And a lot of people listen to my podcast love the background work as well. And that's why I would love to hear all those reasons. I want to hear what you have to say about those things. And you can,
I think one of the great issues in the church, and I just submitted an article, so we'll see where that goes. But on one of the issues facing the church is, what do we divide over, right? Mm-hmm. So I think get this hopefully from reading the scriptures, right? I think there are some things we have to divide over, right? And I think we all agree on that. Well, not all, that's not right, but faithful believers, I think, all agree that there are points where we have to divide. And I think we all agree, hopefully at least, there are some things that we can agree to disagree on, right? You look at 1 Corinthians 8-10 or Romans, things like that, right? Where do we draw those lines, I think, is a tremendously important question. Because, I mean, I haven't listened to all of your stuff, but I've listened to enough to know that we do have some fundamental disagreements on some things, right? And even some things that I hold, fairly strongly, right? But there's a far cry from, I think this guy's a heretic, to, we interpret this passage of scripture differently. And that leads to some different implications for ministry in the context of the church. And I think, especially in a social media age, and I think this is what you're alluding to, we just end up lobbing grenades at each other. I mean, I think that's going on right now, quite frankly, in a lot of contexts, without ever really even understanding the other person and understanding, is this an issue that has to divide us?
Right. Oh, preach.
So I think that's a tremendously important topic for the church today.
When you, because I'm just curious, when you said some things you fundamentally disagree, what some of the podcasts you've listened to?
Well, I didn't mean that. That might have sounded worse than I thought it. I didn't
mean
it to come across terrible.
I'm not asking to defend it. I'm just really curious which ones is it.
So like, and this won't shock you coming from my background, but like some of I think I was reading through your blog the other day where you're referencing Craig Keener on, see, this is, how do we phrase this, but like women preaching, for example.
Oh, yeah. I would love to talk about that with you. Yeah, go ahead.
That would be one example. I was listening to, you were tweeting it out at 4:00 in the morning, and so I was up because that's what I do now, apparently. So I was listening to you talk about the example of whatever it was, clothings of mixed fabric and homosexuality in the Old Testament or whatever. We're in fundamental agreement on that issue. I probably would have said some things differently, right? So those were two issues. I really enjoyed the one on the homosexuality issue. And I don't think I had fundamental disagreements there, though I probably would have pushed harder on a couple of different issues. But yeah, so I mean, I didn't mean that. Maybe it came across in a way.
No, come across. No. That's right. No, I really, that's another great one. Yes, I would love to hear. I think that would be real good for the audience to hear. I mean it. Because I want I humbly try my best in my podcasts, my sermons, my all the time, to try my best that when there are that when there are, as far as I understand them, different major views in the Christian tradition, to say that, to say, for example, Calvinism, Reform, whatever. I mean, I'm not that at all. Are you?
No, I don't. That's a whole nother ball of wax, right?
That's my point. But that's the kind of thing. So when I present them that are women in ministry, leadership, whatever, I mean, I'll try my best to say, here's my view. I don't find the other persuasive, or dispensationalism. I mean, there are views that I try my best. So that's why I think from a podcast listener, it'd be great to hear, because if you have a different view on that women shouldn't be X, Y, Z, well, man, I want them to, I like for people to hear it from the proverbial horse's mouth. Really, because that way, and I tell my audience all the time, don't take my word for it, go do the research yourself. At the same time, I understand that most people are they're trying to hear a voice of authority in some degree. And, but anyway, I'm trying to point them out to there are other people out there. So anyway, that thing is good. Just like with the Matthew example, I think it's great, man, brother. Thank you. I know you could be plenty of times VIP, top dog professor. You could be doing other things with your time. I appreciate it, brother. Thanks, brother. Thanks for talking. See you. Bye-bye. Well, the conversation isn't finished. You can always reach out to me on social media. Are you on Facebook? I am too. At Glimpse of the Kingdom. Glimpse of the Kingdom on Facebook. Be sure to like it, and you can see updates there. Also, if you're on Twitter, check me out at Dr. D. Pendergrass, at Dr. D. Pendergrass, or at Glimpse the King, at Glimpse the King. And I try my best to respond to comments and questions on there as quickly as I can. If you want more, there are many more resources on the podcast and my blog. Go to my website, davidpendergrass.com, and you can see a full list of the podcast, and my blog is available for free. Are you active in a church right now? I'd be happy to come out to your church and do all kinds of classes and workshops there. Check out davidpendergrass.com, davidpendergrass.com for more information. And may God in His great grace give you even just a glimpse of His kingdom this week. See you next time.